The bride slapped the elderly black waitress at her own wedding, unaware that she was the groom's adoptive mother. The smack echoed through the crystal ballroom like a gunshot. Dead silence. 300 guests froze with their glasses in the air, watching the 64-year-old woman stagger backward, her trembling hand covering the red mark forming on her dark face. "You incompetent fool. You ruined my $50,000 dress," screamed Victoria, the bride, her blue eyes blazing with hatred as she pointed to the drops of champagne that stained the Italian silk of her gown. "What kind of place hires people like this to serve at real weddings?" The waitress, impeccable black uniform and grey hair pulled back into a discreet bun, stood with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the hysteria of the 28-year-old woman before her. Donna Ruth had served hundreds of events in her 40-year career, but she had never been humiliated like this. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel was decorated like a modern fairy tale. White flowers imported from Holland, baccarat crystal chandeliers, and a 5-tier cake that cost more than the annual salary of any employee present. Victoria had obsessively planned every detail. After all, marrying David Thompson, heir to one of the largest real estate fortunes in the country, deserved nothing less than absolute perfection. "Someone get this person out of my sight before I call security." Victoria spat the words like poison, her voice echoing through the microphone that was still attached to her ceremony dress. The other waiters froze. Some guests whispered nervously. At the head table, Victoria's parents smiled approvingly. Finally, someone was putting these people in their place. Donna Ruth bowed silently, beginning to pick up the shards of crystal from the marble floor. Her hands, marked by decades of honest labor, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a pain that went far beyond public humiliation. What no one in that gilded hall knew was that 22 years ago, that same woman had found an 8-year-old boy abandoned in the rain in Detroit. A skinny boy she took home, raised as her own, and who grew up affectionately calling her mom, a boy named David Thompson. As Victoria continued her show for the guests, Donna Ruth discreetly looked up toward the main staircase of the hall. There, standing like a marble statue in his Armani tuxedo, was the groom. Their eyes met for an infinite second, and in that glance, she saw something that made her heart race. David had witnessed everything. The woman he had just promised to love until death had just publicly humiliated the only person in the world he truly loved. The irony was too cruel to be a coincidence. Did fate have a sense of humor? Or was this just the beginning of something much bigger? If you're wondering how this story of prejudice and hypocrisy will end, be sure to subscribe to the channel, because when the past meets the present in a hall full of elite, the masks don't take long to fall, and some falls are more devastating than others. 22 years earlier, David Thompson was the heir to nothing. He was just an 8-year-old boy, too thin for his age, sitting alone in the rain outside an overcrowded shelter in Detroit. His soaked clothes clung to his small body as he clutched a plastic bag containing his only possessions, a faded photo of his parents who had died in an accident, and a teddy bear missing an eye. Mrs. Ruth was leaving her double shift at the hospital when she saw him. She had been working as a cleaning assistant for 15 years, earning little, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment. At 42, she had never had children. Life had not given her that chance. But on that rainy night, life gave her David. "Hi, sweetie. Are you hungry?" she asked, kneeling on the wet sidewalk, not caring that her hospital uniform would get dirty. The boy looked up. His eyes were large and dark, filled with a sadness that no child should carry. "I don't have any money," he murmured. Ruth smiled, That genuine smile that would become David's emotional anchor for years to come. Who said anything about money? Come with me. I'll make you some hot chocolate. That night, David slept on her couch. The next morning, he was still there. And the following month, too, Ruth never made the adoption official. She couldn't afford expensive lawyers. But in practice, David Thompson became Ruth's David, and she became the most important woman in his life. She worked 3 jobs to pay for his private school. She woke up at 4 a.m. to clean offices, then went to the hospital, and at night, she cleaned restaurants. David grew up seeing those hands, always busy, always tired, always working to give him opportunities she never had. Mom, he would say. He had started calling her that after 3 months. When I grow up, I'm going to get you a big house. You don't need a big house, son. You just need to be a good man, she would reply, running her hand through his hair as she helped him with his homework at the small kitchen table. At 16, David won a full scholarship to an elite university. Ruth cried on his high school graduation day. Tears of pride mixed with the pain of knowing he was leaving for a world she could never fully understand. During college, David called every week. How are you, Mom? Everything's fine here. How about you? Are you eating right? Are you making friends? What she didn't tell him was that she was now working 4 jobs so she could send him $200 a month, money to make sure he didn't go without, even with the scholarship. David found this out years later, when he stumbled upon her bank statements. At university, David excelled in business and finance. He was smart, focused, but above all, he was humble. His wealthy classmates noticed that he was different. He worked part-time, didn't go to expensive parties, and always sent half of any money he earned home. He graduated magna cum laude and landed an internship at an investment firm. Within 5 years, he became a partner. Within 10, he was a millionaire. At 30, he was one of the most respected businessmen in the country. The first thing he did, when he signed his first $1 million contract, was to buy a house for Mrs. Ruth. Not a mansion. She didn't want ostentation. A simple, comfortable house in a safe neighborhood with a garden where she could grow tomatoes. Son, this is too much, she protested the day he handed her the keys. Mom, this isn't even the beginning of what I owe you, he replied, hugging her tightly. It was in this house that 2 years later, David met Victoria. He had gone to dinner with Ruth, as he did every Friday without fail, when Victoria arrived unexpectedly. She was the daughter of important clients and had obtained the address through contacts. I thought you lived in that fancy Manhattan building, Victoria said, barely hiding her surprise at seeing the modest house. I do, but I come to have dinner with my mother every week, David replied simply. Victoria looked at Mrs. Ruth serving dinner in the kitchen and murmured, "She's cute." Well, authentic. David didn't pick up on the condescending tone at that moment. He was in love, blinded by Victoria's beauty and charm, but Mrs. Ruth did. Women like her develop a sixth sense for detecting prejudice disguised as politeness. In the months that followed, Victoria rarely accompanied David on his visits. She always had social engagements, important events, things you would understand if you were in my circle, as she put it. Ruth never said anything directly. But David began to notice small details, how Victoria changed her tone of voice when talking to employees, how she looked at people who were different from her, how she made subtle comments about people who don't know their place. And now, 22 years after that first meeting in the rain, David was watching the woman, who claimed to love him publicly humiliate the only person in the world who truly loved him unconditionally. Victoria continued her show for the guests, posing for photos and accepting compliments for the perfect wedding. Mrs. Ruth had discreetly retired to the service kitchen, where she sat down on a plastic chair and took a deep breath, trying to process what had happened. But David Thompson was no longer that 8-year-old boy in the rain. He was a man who had built an empire because he learned early on that some people show who they really are when they think no one important is watching. And at that moment, watching Victoria laugh with her friends about the incident with the clumsy maid, David realized that he had spent 2 years planning a wedding with a complete stranger. The burning question in his mind was not whether he should do something. The question was, what would be the most polite way to show 300 guests who Victoria really was behind that mask of fig-ned kindness? David stood motionless at the top of the staircase for exactly 23 seconds. Enough time for every cell in his body to process what he had just witnessed. 23 seconds for 2 decades of gratitude to turn into cold, calculated fury. Victoria continued to receive compliments, laughing with her friends about the incident with the clumsy maid. Her parents commented loudly enough for others to hear. Finally, someone put those people in their place. Victoria really has a firm hand. In the service kitchen, Donna Ruth sat in a plastic chair, her hands trembling slightly as she applied ice to her bruised face. Marcus, the head chef who had known her for years, approached her with concern. "Donna Ruth, do you want me to call someone? A doctor? The police?" She shook her head. "No, son. I've been through worse. This will pass." But David wasn't going to let it pass. He descended the stairs with the elegance of a predator, greeting guests with mechanical smiles while his mind worked in overdrive. Every handshake, every congratulations on your wedding was fuel for what was being quietly constructed in his head. "David, what a wonderful party," exclaimed Mrs. Peaton, one of Victoria's most important clients. "Your wife is simply stunning, and what a strong personality. I loved how she handled that awkward situation earlier." "Awkward situation?" David asked, keeping his tone neutral. "That clumsy waitress who stained her dress." Victoria was very polite. "Considering the circumstances, I would have done much worse." David nodded slowly. "I understand perfectly." 20 minutes later, while Victoria posed for more photos, David discreetly made his way to the kitchen. He found Donna Ruth still seated, now helping to pack up the leftovers from the banquet, even injured. Her maternal instincts not to waste food remained intact. "Mother," he whispered, kneeling beside her. Donna Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "Son, don't make a scene because of me. Today is your special day." "It was my special day. Now it's something completely different." David gently held her hands. "I need you to go home and rest. Marcus will take you and Mom don't watch TV for the next few days." "Okay." Mrs. Ruth studied her son's face. There was something in his eyes that she hadn't seen since the hard times in Detroit. A cold determination that only appeared when someone had crossed an uncrossable line. "David, what are you going to do?" "What I should have done a long time ago. I am going to show 300 people who they really applauded today." While Marcus escorted Mrs. Ruth to the service exit, David returned to the hall. He spotted James Morrison, his business partner and best friend since college, talking to a group of investors near the bar. "James, I need to talk to you now." The two moved away to a more private corner. David told him everything in 2 direct sentences. James turned pale. "Man, I'm sorry, but what are you going to do? The wedding has already happened. Everything is signed. James, do you remember why we started our company? To prove that people like us could be successful without compromising our values." "Exactly. And today I found out that I'm about to spend the rest of my life married to everything we fought against." David pulled out his cell phone. "I need you to record a conversation for me discreetly, but with good quality." "David, are you sure? Once this gets out, there's no turning back." The turning point was lost the moment she raised her hand against my mother. David returned to the center of the hall where Victoria was cutting the cake alongside her parents. He approached her with a warm smile, kissed her cheek, and whispered, "Honey, can we talk for a minute alone?" Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Now we are in the middle of the party. It'll be quick about that incident earlier." Her face instantly closed. "What incident with the waitress? I want to understand better what happened." Victoria looked around, checking to see who might be listening, then pulled him into a corner near the window. James positioned himself strategically a few feet away. Cell phone discreetly pointed. "David, it was just a stupid accident. She stained my dress and I reacted. End of story." "You slapped her. So what? She was a clumsy waitress. She needs to learn to be more careful." Victoria crossed her arms. "I don't understand why you're making such a big deal out of this." "A clumsy waitress," David repeated slowly. "Interesting choice of words." "What choice of words?" "That's what she is. People like that need to know their place." David felt something break inside his chest. "People like that." "David, for God's sake, you're being dramatic. She was just an old black woman who didn't know what she was doing. She probably doesn't even speak English properly. Someone had to teach her boundaries." Silence, Victoria continued, interpreting the silence as agreement. "I'm glad you understand. That's why I love you. You have enough class not to mix with riffraff. Imagine if you were one of those nouveau riches who defend these people just because they have money now." "These people," David repeated, his voice almost inaudible. "Exactly. Everyone in their place. You know, we have our class, they have theirs. When someone forgets that, they need to be reminded." "That's all I did." David looked at Victoria, as if he was seeing her for the first time. The woman before him was a complete stranger. Worse than a stranger. She was everything he deeply despised. "I understand perfectly, dear. Thank you very much for clarifying." Victoria smiled, relieved. "I'm glad you understand. Now, let's get back to the party. We have to cut the cake with my parents." As she walked away, David remained standing. James approached, putting away his cell phone. "Did you get everything? Every word? Clear audio? Perfect video?" James paused. "David, did she really say all that? And worse, much worse?" David watched Victoria posing for photos with the cake, smiling radiantly for the cameras. In a few hours, she would be the one being filmed, but under completely different circumstances. "James, how many journalists do we have on our contact list?" "About 15, 16. "Why?" "And lawyers who specialize in marriage annulments." David and public relations specialists who deal with image crisis. James understood where the conversation was going. Are you sure about this? David took one last look at Victoria, who was now laughing with her friends about something he couldn't hear. Probably more comments about people who need to know their place. James, my mother sacrificed 20 years of her life to give me opportunities. She worked 3 jobs, went hungry, never bought anything for herself. And today, on what should be the happiest day of my life, she was publicly humiliated by the person I chose to share my future with. David took a deep breath. The party will continue for another 2 hours. Enough time to set a few things in motion. Tomorrow morning, when Victoria wakes up, she'll discover that some choices have consequences that go far beyond what she can imagine. The moment those words left his mouth, Victoria laughed loudly in the center of the hall, raising a glass of champagne for another toast. Her eyes sparkled with genuine happiness. The happiness of someone who believed she has achieved everything she ever wanted. What she didn't know was that a few feet away, the man who had just promised to love her forever was orchestrating the most elegant and devastating destruction her reputation would ever suffer. And this time, it wouldn't be a clumsy old black woman who didn't know her place. 2 hours later, as the champagne still bubbled in the glasses and the guests delighted in French desserts, David stepped onto the small stage where the band had played during dinner. The microphone echoed through the gilded hall, and gradually the conversation ceased. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for making this day so special, he began, his voice calm and controlled. Victoria smiled radiantly from the center of the hall, thinking her husband would give the traditional thank you speech. But before we close this wonderful evening, I would like to share something very important with all of you. An expectant silence filled the room. James discreetly positioned himself near the main doors, smartphone in hand, broadcasting everything live to an audience that was growing exponentially. Today at this party, I witnessed something that made me completely rethink the meaning of family, respect, and character. David paused, his eyes meeting Victoria's. One of the most important people in my life was publicly assaulted and humiliated by someone who should represent love and compassion. Victoria felt a chill in her stomach. Some guests began to whisper, trying to understand where David was going with this. Mrs. Ruth Silver, David continued, has been working for 40 years serving families at events like this. She's a 64-year-old woman, honest, hard-working, who has never heard a fly in her entire life. His voice began to gain strength. And today she was physically assaulted for staining a dress. The room exploded in murmurs. Victoria tried to gesture for David to stop, but he ignored her completely. What makes this even more disturbing, David raised his voice, is that the person responsible for this assault considered it normal to hit an elderly woman because she was just a waitress. Victoria began to walk toward the stage, panic written all over her face. David, what are you doing? Stop it. Donna Ruth Silver isn't just a waitress, Victoria. David's voice cut through the air like a knife. She's my mother. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people froze simultaneously, glasses suspended in midair. Victoria stopped in her tracks, her face draining of color. My adoptive mother, David continued, who found me orphaned at the age of 8, raised me alone, worked 3 jobs to pay for my education, and sacrificed her entire youth so that I could be here today in front of all of you. Cell phone cameras rose like a digital forest. James' live stream already had over 10,000 viewers, and the number was rising rapidly. And 2 hours ago, my wife, the woman I just promised to love and honor, slapped the woman who is responsible for everything I am today. Victoria tried to speak, but no sound came out. Some guests began to instinctively move away from her. But maybe you think I'm exaggerating. David pulled out his smartphone. Maybe you think it was just a misunderstanding. So, I'll let Victoria explain her feelings herself. With a tap on the screen, Victoria's crystal-clear voice began to echo through the hall speakers. She was just an old black woman who didn't know what she was doing. She probably doesn't even speak English properly. Someone had to teach her boundaries. Audible gasps rippled through the room. Several people covered their mouths in shock. These people need to know their place. The recording continued. Everyone in their place. We have our class. They have theirs. When someone forgets that, they need to be reminded. Victoria stood frozen in the center of the room, surrounded by looks of horror and contempt. That was taken out of context, she cried desperately. Context? David raised an eyebrow. The context of you saying my mother is riffraff, who needs to know her place. The recording continued. I'm glad you understand. That's why I love you. You have enough class not to mix with riffraff. Victoria's father, seated at the head table, was red with embarrassment. Important businessmen began to rise and discreetly make their way toward the exit. Mrs. Peaton, who hours earlier had praised Victoria, now looked at her with obvious disgust. 36 minutes, David announced calmly. That's how long it took for Victoria's advertising contracts to be cancelled after James started the live broadcast. Apparently, reputable companies don't like to associate their brands with people who assault elderly people for fun. Victoria rushed to the stage. You can't do this to me. We are married. David pulled an envelope from the inside pocket of his tuxedo. Actually, we are not. These are the annulment papers my lawyer prepared. Marriages based on fraud, such as hiding one's true character, can be annulled immediately. Fraud? What fraud? Victoria was hysterical. Now, you spent 2 years convincing me you were a decent person. That's called emotional fraud. David stepped down from the stage, handing her the envelope. Besides, assaulting the elderly is a federal crime. My mother has already filed a complaint. Your mother? Victoria laughed desperately. That woman is not your real mother. The entire hall fell silent again. David approached her, his voice low but audible to everyone. Victoria, she has given me more love in 20 years than you have managed to simulate in 2. Who do you think is more my family? At that moment, Mrs. Ruth appeared at the entrance to the hall. She had returned because she had forgotten her purse. Seeing the commotion, she stopped hesitantly. David walked over to her. Mom, come here. There are some people who need to get to know you properly. With infinite tenderness, he offered his arm to Donor Ruth. Together, they walked down the center of the hall under the absolute silence of 300 embarrassed people. This is Mrs. Ruth Silver, David announced. A retired nurse, volunteer at 3 charitable organizations, and the most dignified woman I have ever known. And to me, she will always be simply Mom. Victoria watched petrified as guests who minutes before had been fawning over her now bowed respectfully to greet Mrs. Ruth. The shift in power in the hall was palpable and devastating. The wedding is off, David said to Victoria for the last time. Security will escort you out. Your belongings will be sent tomorrow. As Victoria was led out screaming, protesting, and threatening lawsuits, donor Ruth gently touched her son's arm. "Son, you didn't have to do this for me." David kissed her forehead. "Mom, I did. Some lessons can only be taught publicly." The moment the doors closed behind Victoria, the phones in the hall began to vibrate simultaneously. Notifications of a viral video. Bride assaults elderly woman at wedding and discovers she was the groom's mother. In less than an hour, it had 3 million views. Victoria had lost not only a husband, but a reputation built over years. And the man she thought she could manipulate had just proven that underestimating the wrong family can cost much more than a stained dress. The question that remained was not whether Victoria would be able to recover from this public humiliation. It was whether she would ever understand that a person's true value is never measured by the color of their skin or the size of their bank account, but by the greatness of their heart. 3 months later, Victoria discovered that some falls are irreversible. The wedding video reached 50 million views in 2 weeks. Her career as an influencer evaporated instantly. Brands cancelled million-dollar contracts before the sun even rose the next day. The apartment in Manhattan, mortgaged to pay lawyers who failed to reverse her public humiliation. She now worked as a saleswoman in a suburban department store using her maiden name and praying that no one would recognize her. It's ironic how life sometimes puts people who despise ordinary work in exactly the position they always criticized. David, on the other hand, prospered spectacularly. His technology company received a flood of new customers after the episode. People wanted to do business with a man who put family values above social convenience. He was on the cover of 3 business magazines in a single week. Mrs. Ruth became a respected figure in the city. She received invitations to give lectures on dignity and perseverance, but declined most of them. She preferred to continue her volunteer work with abandoned seniors. "Son," she said to David one Friday night. "Fame fades but character remains." The criminal case against Victoria resulted in community service and a hefty fine for 6 months. Ironically, she served meals to needy elderly people under the direct supervision of donor Ruth, who insisted on personally overseeing her to ensure she learned her lesson properly. James discreetly filmed one of these sessions. Victoria, her hair tied back, wearing a simple uniform, serving soup to ladies of the same age as donor Ruth. The contrast with the arrogant bride of months before was devastating and perfect. "You know what strikes me the most?" David commented, watching the video. "She still doesn't understand that the problem was never the stained dress." Donor Ruth smiled. That wise smile of someone who has seen life take many turns. Some people need to lose everything to learn that they never had anything really important. David hugged his mother tightly. "Thank you for teaching me that family is not about blood, but about love and respect. And thank you for showing me that raising a child right is the greatest revenge against those who believe that people like us don't deserve dignity." A year later, David remarried to a doctor he had met at a charity event. The ceremony was simple, intimate, held in the garden of Mrs. Ruth's house. Victoria watched the stories of old acquaintances alone in her rented apartment. The best revenge, David discovered, was not to humiliate Victoria publicly. It was to build a life where genuine love overcame superficiality, where character surpassed social class, and where a 64-year-old woman, who had worked her entire life, was treated with the royalty she always deserved. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel for more narratives that prove a simple truth. Those who sow disrespect reap loneliness, but those who cultivate gratitude always reap multiplied.